I'm Karen McKercher, CEO and co-founder of 22 Group. In this video, I'm going to show you how to better understand your buyer's contracting priorities so that you can take better control of your own redline cycles and close more deals faster. For the better part of the past decade, I've served as outside counsel to Fortune 500 companies, reviewing and redlining sales agreements from software and SaaS sellers just like you. And it's that experience that really made me aware that selling teams could use better tools, techniques, and training to help them address buyers' contracting needs in much the same way they were addressing buyers' needs through their buyers' users' needs through their solutions. According to data from the World Commerce and Contracting Association, SaaS companies are leaving $9 billion on sales annually. Each year, SaaS companies are missing out on $9 billion in annual revenues caused by long contracting cycles. And as SaaS continues to grow, it seems likely that this redlining challenge will grow along the same trajectory. So I'm guessing that you're here because your experience with redlines has been fraught with frustration. Long redline cycles are frustrating for both sides of the deal. They're frustrating for your buyer's team too. I'm going to show you how to change that experience for both sides through smarter contracting on your side. What so many sellers get wrong is that they don't think about the buyer as a whole. They do a really good job of solving pain point for their users team, but they often neglect to nurture that part of the buyer's buying team that's not directly involved in using the solution. Yet those traditionally neglected parts of the buyer's team have incredible influence on whether vendors have long and lasting relationships with their organization. So I'm going to share with you information that will help you not only solve your problems, but will help you solve your buyer's problems in a much broader sense. And when you solve that piece of the puzzle, when you demonstrate to the enterprise buyer that you're a good vendor, you're a partner for the entire enterprise organization, you will leverage a strategic advantage that your competitors aren't even thinking about. In this video, I'm going to provide you in detail with the 5 steps of our proprietary frictionless close process. This is the same process we use with our paying customers to help them dramatically reduce the time they spend in redlines. And if you successfully implement this, you should be able to cut the redline cycle by as many as 15 weeks, to increase revenues by as much as 9%, and to do it in a way that you don't have to rely on outside lawyers, but you can depend on greater independence with your selling team. And equally important, you're going to be a vendor the entire buyer organization enjoys working with as much as the user team enjoys using your product. The frictionless close system is based on more than 3,000 enterprise contracts reviewed, 334 different technologies, and more than 210 million in closed enterprise deals. When you're implementing the frictionless close system, you want to keep 3 objectives front and center. The first is that you're going to want to use data-driven tools designed to close the deal. The second is that you're going to streamline the process and empower your team to be accountable. The goal here is to eliminate the number of times a contract issue is escalated to your leadership team or an outside lawyer. And the third objective is to make sure that the team most invested in the deal continues to control the deal through close. Handing control of the deal over to someone who is not directly involved or invested in the deal is like bringing in your third string quarterback when you're in the red zone. With the right tools and training and techniques, there's no reason your sales team can't negotiate the sales agreement themselves. You're not going to hear very many lawyers say this, but you really don't need a lawyer for day-to-day contract review. If you prefer that your sales team remain focused on non-contracting sales matters, that's fine. I would recommend that you bring in a smart project management type who can chase the paper and do the contract negotiations, but reports to your sales team. But save your legal budget for important strategic matters. Your deal team or a project manager reporting to your deal team can absolutely do the contract negotiations and redlines themselves. And they don't have to turn it over to someone who isn't as invested and doesn't feel the urgency in the way that your sales team does. You probably have a gut level instinct of what's tripping you up in the redline cycle, but you really want to quantify it. You need data that demonstrates to you what you've been agreeing to and under the circumstances to which you've been deviating from your standard provisions. So the first step of the frictionless close system is to review your signed enterprise deals from the past 12 months. You want to be able to review enough agreements that you have a representative sample, so perhaps somewhere between 30 and 50 agreements. If you haven't done 30 deals with enterprise organizations in the past year, then perhaps consider extending the period of review to 18 or 24 months. And if you've done more than 50, then maybe consider a sampling of 50 to 75% of those enterprise deals. Then for each agreement, you're going to identify the buyer's industry, the contract value, whether the buyer perceived your solution to be a nice to have or mission critical, such that if your solution goes down, the lights go off, whether you're handling high, moderate, or low proprietary or confidential information, whose paper the deal was done on, whether you handle, access, store, process personal information, and if so, whose personal information are you handling? And finally, did you do a DPA, and if so, whose DPA did you use? Then you're going to track each provision and determine whether the buyer agreed to your standard provision or if you agreed to a deviation. I'm not going to kid you, pulling this together and setting up the system to track the data and then getting the data into the system is a pretty heavy lift. We've developed a proprietary tool that we use, but you can probably use Excel or Google Sheets or some similar type spreadsheet program, but it is a pretty involved process. However, it will pay off in dividends once you've actually captured and analyzed this information. So let's look at an example of how we track the data. Here we see that we have a standard super cap of $3 million. And we see that in 2 of the agreements, our buyers agreed to the $3 million super cap. But in 1 of our agreements, we agreed to an increased super cap of $5 million. Some of the provisions you're going to track are going to have multiple parts to them. So again, example of limitation of liability, you're not going to track just the amount of the cap, but you're going to also track what events are subject to that cap. So maybe it's a breach of confidentiality or gross negligence. And then in addition to each of the standard provisions in your term, you're going to capture any unique provisions that your buyer imposed. Now that you have all that data into the system, you want to really dig in and analyze under what conditions are you deviating from your standard terms. What do those deviations look like? How frequently are you making those deviations? Do the way those deviations look change depending on certain conditions being present? So returning to our super cap, was there something that made us, something about the deal or the buyer that made us agree to a higher super cap? Was this a one-off occasion, or are there multiple occasions where we've agreed to an increase in the super cap? If there are multiple occasions, then what ties those buyers or those deals together? Is it a higher contract value, a certain buyer profile, or a specific use case? You really want to dig into this data so that you can identify patterns and determine what's going on, because you're going to use that information in steps 2 and 3. With a deep analysis and super solid information, you now have exactly what you need to eliminate the number one cause of long redline cycles. The biggest reason redlining takes so long is that we're not using contracts designed to close the deal. All contracts are intended to address the parameters of a relationship by defining the parties' rights, allocating risk, and setting performance expectations. Unfortunately, both sides of the deal typically start with a very party-centric position. So that means that if the seller's paper is very pro-seller and the buyer's paper is very pro-buyer. But instead of an agreement that's strictly focused on protecting a party, you need an agreement that is more balanced. Whether an agreement is balanced or not is not an analysis about whether the agreement is fair. It's whether the deal taken as a whole, not just pricing, but the allocation of risk and rights and obligations, is the agreement as a whole profitable enough? The very act of redlining then becomes a case-by-case or buyer-by-buyer or sale-by-sale process of getting to an agreement that is profitable enough. It's moving closer to the middle, balancing the rights, risks, and obligations in such a way that both parties perceive adequate value from the agreement. With the data that you've gathered in step 1, you have a much better idea of where the middle is, and if the goal is to reduce redlines, we can use that data to prepare agreements that are closer to the middle to begin with. We can use that data to find a more market appropriate agreement that represents satisfactory value for both sides. The second step in the frictionless close system is to use that intelligence so that you can revise your sales agreement in a way that it more accurately reflects what you're actually agreeing to. You're going to prepare a template that better reflects market expectations. You're going to prepare a close the deal agreement. So circling back to our limitation of liability example, if 90% of the time you're agreeing to a higher super cap, then why not agree to that higher super cap in the first place and address the risk in a different way, perhaps by purchasing additional insurance coverage or investing in tighter security? Maybe you discovered that in 50% of your deals you're agreeing to a higher super cap, but only when the contract value exceeds a certain threshold. It might make sense then to prepare a different version of the agreement that you pull out when you know that the contract value is going to meet or exceed that threshold. These are also the kinds of variations that you're going to capture in your playbook, which is a tool we'll talk about in greater detail in step 3. But the point here is that you're going to revise your standard agreement so it will be a better business tool for closing your deal. Speaking of better business tools, it's important to think about who uses the agreement once the deal is closed. It might be the technical team who refers to the agreement to identify who they need to notify if there's a suspected security breach. Or it might be the support team who needs to determine what credits they owe a buyer if they've slipped SLAs. It might be your user team who needs to figure out how much notice period they need before they can signal their intent to renew. But it's typically not the lawyer unless things have foobarred pretty badly. A business tool should be one that is effective for the people who use it. It needs to be an accessible tool and one that is easily understood. In a sales agreement that's easily understood is one that is drafted clearly and concisely, one that minimizes the use of prepositional phrases and uses active voice to make it clear who is required to do what and when. The added benefit of an accessible agreement is that a clearly written, plainly understood agreement is one that doesn't have to be referred to outside counsel for interpretation. In addition to using the data that you discovered in the audit to revise your agreement so that it's more reflective of market terms, you're going to use that data to facilitate your team's ability to do their own contract negotiations by creating a playbook. Your contracting playbook will be the authority for closing deals. It represents the accumulation and continuous capture of institutional knowledge and enables your team to effectively and efficiently conduct contract negotiations. As you are no doubt well aware, there are higher and better uses of your leadership team's time than to be caught up in the minutia of day-to-day contracting. Creating a playbook ensures that your team can confidently manage contract negotiations without escalating to the C-suite every time a buyer imposes something that's not part of your standard terms. Your playbook needs to be a comprehensive manual that covers the entire contracting process, from initiating a draft to capturing signatures and post-close signatures like storage protocols or operationalizing any unique obligations imposed by your buyer. So you're going to start with policies and procedures. For example, who has signing authority and what are the limits on that authority? You're going to include a buyer's reviewer persona so that your team continues to understand the people that they're selling to and can understand the challenges that the buyer's team faces so that your seller can continue to effectively flex their empathy muscle throughout the redline process. By the way, we have a buyer's reviewer persona that we use for our customers, and we are more than happy to share that with you. If you want to just drop an email to service@22.group, we'll get that out to you right away. You want to include etiquette or best practices that you want your team to practice when redlining. For example, a really good rule is to make sure that you're always explaining any redline changes that you're requesting or any changes that your buyer is requesting that you can't agree to. You want to explain your contract structure and identify each of the agreements that support the sales process and when those agreements are used. You want to include a full copy of each of the agreements and then a full text of each of the provisions. And with the full text of each of the provisions, you want to include a plain English explanation of the provision so that your team understands the risk and the extent of any damages to which your business may be exposed if that risk is realized. For each standard provision, you're also going to include fallback alternatives to which your team can agree and under which conditions those fallback alternatives are acceptable. Some of these fallback provisions should be evident from the data that you uncovered during the audit. Then you're going to take those talking points and you're going to make sure that your team can explain why they can or cannot agree to a buyer's redline change, or why your reviewing team is making a modification request. The goal of the playbook is to make sure that each team member involved in the redlining process understands each of the terms in your agreement and the risk that they present to your company if the buyer doesn't agree to your standard provisions. And then they also need to understand why and when an alternative to your standard provisions are acceptable. The playbook is a sort of sales contracting 101 resource that your team can use to trade just enough to be dangerous for knowing enough to be safe and smart. And that will put an end to punting on or hacking contract negotiations. Risk is a business issue, and risk tolerance is a business decision. So when you and your team understand the business risk associated with each provision in your agreement, you understand whether or not you can accept that risk is a business decision. It is not a legal decision. So in addition to empowering your team to avoid escalation to the leadership team with clear explanations of the risk associated with each provision and with clear guidance about how to negotiate those provisions, your playbook also helps you avoid the need to turn to an outside lawyer for advice. Steps 1 through 3 of the frictionless close system are designed to arm you with effective tools to move you closer to signature faster. Step 4 and 5 will really address the efficient practice of contracting. First thing you want to think about is starting to think about terms early. I don't mean how many users is the buyer going to need, how many seats is the buyer going to need, what is the price per unit, or how long will the subscription term be. I mean what are typically referred to as the legal terms. When I say start thinking about terms early, what I mean is that a discussion of what are traditionally considered commercial terms include the caveat that those commercial terms are effective as long as the buyer substantially agrees to your standard terms. You may think this is obvious, but in 90% of the deals that I did as an enterprise lawyer, the seller had negotiated pricing well before contract negotiations had even been opened. We recommend then that our customers provide their buyers with a summary of material terms and make it crystal clear that any pricing discussion is predicated on the buyer's agreement with those terms. Even though you've done the audit and you have a pretty good understanding of what the market expects, and your standard agreement is now reflective of that market expectation, your audit is incomplete picture of the broader market as a whole. First, it reflects what just a portion of the market has demanded of you. And second, it reflects a limited duration, a limited period of time. You're likely to come up against buyers who are going to have different expectations than your previous buyers. And market expectations are constantly evolving. Even though the term sheet or summary of terms isn't legally binding, it puts the buyer on notice that any deviation from those standard terms may have an impact on pricing. And this is important because sometimes buyers' requirements can have real out-of-pocket expenses and costs associated with them that impact your margins. And so if you're having this conversation with your buyer early, then reopening discussions about pricing is not nearly so awkward or uncomfortable. The enterprise purchasing process typically involves a number of steps and different teams reflecting a multitude of stakeholders you'll need to get through and address before you can ink the deal and collect your revenues. The process usually involves procurement, security, finance, accounting, sometimes privacy, and of course legal. And each team has its own policies and procedures it's required to follow as a matter of the broader organizational policy. But here's the thing. You may have a better idea of that process than your user team does. So this is a great opportunity for you to continue adding value. Sometimes the user team hasn't been through the buying process. They're new to the organization or their role, or your solution represents a bigger purchase than their team has made previously, or they're new to the process because the process has changed. So after the buyer's user team has signaled their intent to buy, put your heads together with the user team and lead them through the exercise of making a plan for closing the deal, complete with who owns what. On your process map, identify the processes that you know most enterprise organizations take, even if the user team hasn't called out those processes. And then ask questions like, who do we need to talk to make sure we follow any procurement policies? Who do we need to talk to make sure that we're complying with any privacy policies? Then stack the process where you can. Identify those parts of the processes that can be taken simultaneously rather than linearly. So for example, maybe you can kick off the security assessment while you're engaged with a proof of concept with the user team. Most enterprise legal teams can't send an agreement for signature until the seller has completed the assessment. And once they've completed the assessment, there can sometimes be gaps that the seller team has to close before the parties can sign the agreement. If you identify the parts of the process that can be started early, and if you can complete some of those processes simultaneously, then you can cut weeks off the sales cycle. We recommend that someone on the seller's deal team serve as a point of contact through the entire sales process. Even if you have a person dedicated to contracting, we recommend that the account executive stay involved throughout the entire purchase process. We've found that the account executive can be quite influential in a very positive way in making sure that both sides of the deal stay on task and within timelines. We recommend that our customer's deal team and the account executive in particular make sure they're interfacing directly with the buyer's point person for each process. By staying involved, the account executive can serve as a resource for the buyer's team by tracking down information or other subject matter experts as needed, and then generally facilitating the buyer's contracting process by facilitating the buyer's ability to close their side of the transaction. With step 5, we're addressing activities post-close. Don't make the mistake of believing that the work is done once the contract is signed. The first thing you want to make sure you do after signature is make sure that there are no unique operational obligations imposed by the buyer. These are operational obligations that should have been vetted with the operations team prior to signature, but right now we want to make sure that they have been fully implemented, and you need to confirm that with your operations team. For example, the buyer may require you to notify a particular email address in the event of a suspected security breach. So you're going to want to make sure that that specific email address is added to either your CRM or another data repository from which you pull to provide security notifications. Similarly, you're going to want to track things like renewal date or expiration date and notice period for renewal, invoicing procedures, those kinds of things that the rest of your team may utilize in fulfilling their obligations under the contract. But the bulk of your post-signature activities are going to be on capturing institutional knowledge. There are some people who will advise you to do an annual audit of your agreements. We think that's kind of like reconciling your accounting on day 365 of the fiscal year. It's ill-advised and it's potentially negligent, not to mention a big hairy mess. So we capture our customers' institutional knowledge on a real-time basis by auditing each agreement immediately after signature. And by doing that, we're able to spot and attend to trends quickly. So using the spreadsheet that you used or whatever tool it was that you used to capture the data in your initial audit, you're going to add each closed agreement to that audit each time you close. And you're going to do the same provision by provision analysis that you did in step 1. Similarly, if you're not updating your playbook, its value diminishes pretty quickly. So it's kind of like buying a new car and how that new car immediately depreciates the moment you drive it off the dealer's lot. If you aren't committed to constantly updating your playbook will only be perfect that moment in time when it is initially produced. Market expectations change, laws change, and new laws are enacted. Your technology will likely change, and certainly your policies and procedures will change. So like most strategic plans and tools, your playbook needs to be a living document that constantly evolves as your organization evolves. Each contracting experience that involves any substantive negotiations should be capturing institutional knowledge. Siloed information can be significantly detrimental to an operation or an organization poised for growth. So provide your team with a way to capture their experience with the playbook and make capturing that experience a required part of their job. Did one of them come up against a unique buyer requirement that was unusual or atypical, add it to the playbook. Even if you didn't agree with it or didn't add it to the agreement, capture it anyway because it's likely to come up again. And then note the risk associated with the provision and how the buyer's requirement was handled. Would you handle it the same way? If not, why not? If you would handle it differently, how would you handle it differently? Do you not have enough data to consistently handle it the same way? If so, then identify how to escalate the situation and to whom it should be escalated. So to recap the 5 steps of the frictionless close process. Step 1, you're going to audit, quantify, and identify the patterns that have been coming up in your previously closed enterprise deals. You're going to revise your agreement so that it's a close the deal agreement with market terms designed to be accessible by the people who use it. You're going to empower your team to do negotiations with fewer escalations by providing them with a playbook. You're going to start the process by using a summary of terms. You're going to create a process plan with your user team, and you're going to stay involved to continue adding value and facilitate your buyer's ability to close the deal. And finally, you're going to commit to continuous improvement by tracking and analyzing and capturing your institutional knowledge so that your agreement and your playbook are constantly relevant. We've had a great deal of success implementing our frictionless close system with our customers. And you can take absolutely everything I've laid out on this video and implement it yourself and no doubt elevate your hero status. But I'll tell you what, I don't cut my own hair. And I'm willing to bet you don't cut your own hair either. And it's for a very good reason. And unless you're bald, and then I'm going to have to come up with a different analogy. The point is, you're here because you recognize red lines are a challenge and you want to solve it. But I'll be frank that the skill set required to solve it is unlikely to be within your team's wheelhouse. Even more critical, because it's a huge investment of time and energy, it's going to detract from your mission. You can't be focused on growing your business and learning an entirely new skill set at the same time, especially one that isn't directly attached to your value proposition. And especially when the implementation is going to probably take you somewhere between 3 and 6 months of intense time and energy to fully implement. If you choose to work with us to implement the frictionless close system, however, you can expect to have it up and running within 4 to 6 weeks. You will get updated close the deal sales agreement and a playbook designed to help your team capture enterprise signatures faster. Your team will be confident and knowledgeable and know how to drive the contract to signature. Your C-suite and your leadership team will spend significantly less time dealing with contracts and contract escalations. You will get a team of experts on speed dial, Slack actually, to provide you with quick answers to situations that might have you momentarily stumped. And you'll get ongoing updates so that you're consistently in line with market expectations and capturing rich institutional knowledge. As I've said, in our experience, our customers enjoy immediate improvement in redline efficiency. They're significantly reducing legal spend because their team has sufficient contracting knowledge and effective tools to make intelligent decisions. It will cut redlining process by as many as 15 weeks and increase their revenues by as much as 9%. And critically, our customers' buyers consider them good partners of the enterprise organization, which gives them a serious long-time competitive advantage. Admittedly, we're not a good fit for every company. You will appreciate greater return on your investment if your contract value is $50,000 or higher, if you're taking on average more than 4 weeks to close a contract, if you want to grow your enterprise customer base, and if you're ready, willing, and able, and have leadership support to solve the redline problem in the next 2 to 3 weeks. If that sounds like you, I'm sure the frictionless close system will have significant impact in improving your redlining efficiency. And I should mention, we offer our services with a full money-back guarantee. So if you're not experiencing results, we'll refund your money. If you're ready to stop losing sleep about when those red lines are going to wrap up, or whether you're going to be able to hit your forecasts, if you want to start closing deals and closing them faster, then let's get started. Hit the link below and let's schedule a call. Let's go.